Now I'm very pleased to welcome a good friend, an Indiaspora fellow, and he has just returned recently from India, where he accompanied Secretary Kerry, in fact, who is a special advisor to President Biden on climate change. So please welcome my good friend, Varun Sivaram. Varun?
Thank you, Amar. Wonderful to be here. My wife and I are huge fans of Indiaspora, and you've been a fantastic leader. I remember it was probably more than 5 years ago now, or 4 years ago, the Mission 2022 trip that Indiaspora led to New Delhi, where we charted out a lot of the agenda that now we continue to work on. And I'll also say it's never a good thing to go after Sumant Sinha, particularly when he used to be your boss. So for the last couple of years, I was Sumant's chief technology officer, and I can attest he is a fantastic leader in this space who's pushing India toward a clean energy future. Please do go read his book. After I came back to the US, I joined the Biden-Harris campaign in the faculty of Columbia University, and I've been thrilled to serve Secretary Kerry, who's the United States' first special presidential envoy for climate. And it's a market shift for the United States, obviously market given the last 4 years. But on day one, President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement, and he did more than that. He put climate at the center of US foreign policy. So within a week of being in office, President Biden issued an executive order making sure that climate was integral to every foreign policy and national security decision we made. He created the position of Special Presidential Envoy and appointed Secretary Kerry. And since then, it's been a drumbeat of announcements, a whole of government effort on climate. You saw the $2 trillion American Jobs Plan that has a lot of investments in clean infrastructure. You're going to see over the next 2 days and read the news, the United States making a major new climate commitment, our update to our last commitment under the Paris Agreement that we're going to make by the President's Summit. And that summit is why I've currently got bags under my eyes, because all of us are working lights out to make sure that the President's first 100 days culminates in a summit on Thursday and Friday, April 22 and 23rd, the Leaders Summit on Climate, where we've invited 40 leading countries and heads of state from around the world, including Prime Minister Modi, to talk about raising the world's climate ambition. India in particular has been right on top of Secretary Kerry's radar. My job is I'm his India advisor, and I also lead our team on innovation and global competitiveness. But let me tell you, Secretary Kerry has been both fascinated and super interested in working with India. He spoke with many counterparts from the Minister of External Affairs, Jaishankar, to the Minister of Environment, Javadekar, et cetera, in his first couple days in office, even when call requests were coming in from all over the world. And the reason is that India is absolutely critical to the climate challenge. You heard a lot from Sumant, and so I'm not going to go too far into it, but let me just share a couple statistics. At India's current rate of growth, it's forecast by the International Energy Agency to be the world's second largest emitter by 2040. The US currently is number 2. China, of course, is number 1. But if China does in fact start to meet its 2060 commitment for carbon neutrality, India could surpass China at the current rate of growth sometime by mid-century or shortly thereafter. India represents the world's fastest growing energy demand. And it's a good thing, frankly, because India is industrializing and it's developing. A couple other statistics, even though we might talk a lot about coal power in India, and we just heard a lot from Sumant and Dominic, industry is actually the largest driver of emissions in India. And the coal use in industry, not for power, but for industry, is that driver. But at the same time as India is a large emitter and growing emitter, it's also a huge opportunity. By 2040, India could also be the largest market for solar panels, the largest market in the world for batteries, and it may even be the largest market in the world for hydrogen. So India, in my opinion, is a unique country when it comes to climate action. And that's why this trip that I'll tell you a little bit about with Secretary Kerry was so interesting, because India has already set a super ambitious target. Prime Minister Modi set a target of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. It's second only to China's target, which is 1,200 gigawatts, but China is a much bigger economy. And that target, if India meets it, would put it on a path toward a clean energy transition. It would put it on a path such that the world can keep the Paris target of well under 2 degrees in sight. The problem with India is not ambition, right? There is plenty of ambition. And so with the rest of the world, Secretary Kerry's approach has been to go around the world and raise climate ambition. We do this, with our close allies and with our competitors in every country around the world. But with India, India already has an ambitious target, right? It has targets across transportation, for electric vehicles, for power, for renewable energy. The approach is how do we actually implement what India has set out, which is a remarkably ambitious target. Secretary Kerry has a laser focus on the 2020s. Look, China has a 2060 target that it's made for carbon neutrality. And you saw just last week, Secretary Kerry was out in China. The joint statement that came out focuses on action in the 2020s. Because if we don't start now, we're not going to make very much progress in the decades to come if we build out, for example, large coal fleets. So in India, when we went to India 2 weeks ago, the focus was very much on the 2020s. The India trip actually came after a stop in the Middle East, in the UAE. I won't dwell too much on it, but it was a fascinating trip. My first time traveling with the Secretary. And what he managed to accomplish, he convened 10 countries from around the region for the first regional dialogue focused on climate in particular, from the Middle East and North Africa. And that concluded with a very ambitious joint statement committing to reduce emissions through 2030. Again, this theme of this next critical decade of action. And it also had a lot of side conversations with strategic investors, sovereign wealth funds, for example, who all look at India as a strategic investment destination. So on the heels of this trip where we said, look, India is a red hot investment destination, we headed over to India to discuss how the United States can work with India on a partnership, a high level partnership, in order to advance India's climate implementation of its ambition, of its ambitious goals. Overall, the collaboration kind of fell into 3 buckets of things that we could do for highest impact. The first is to mobilize finance and investment for the technologies that we already have and need to deploy. To meet 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, India is going to need $600 billion between now and 2030. And accelerating the pace of that deployment and having many more Sumant Sinhas, ideally, is how India is going to do it. The second bucket is demonstrating and scaling up technologies. You heard Dominic mention green hydrogen for steel, right? There's this tantalizing prospect for using technology, not just in a lab and not just at small scales, but at massive scales. You can imagine a cluster in the West, in Gujarat or Maharashtra, where you've got these steel plants, or rather refineries, and you can produce green hydrogen as a feedstock into the refineries. In the East, you have your steel plants. In some of those states, you could have a hydrogen cluster where you produce green hydrogen from renewable energy and use it as a reduction agent for your steel production. So lots of interesting things you could do with new technologies for sectors that are really hard to decarbonize. We had a string of meetings in India. We met with Amitabh Kant of Niti Aayog, very, very visionary guy, and things we heard from him. We met with Javadekar at the Environment Ministry, Sitaraman, Finance Ministry. I was impressed with Ministers Pradhan and Singh, the 2 energy-related ministers. Both of them talked about India's great strides and ambition on mobilizing commercial investment for today's technologies, but also investing in the technologies of tomorrow. R.K. Singh, the power minister, talked about a tender for green hydrogen. India was going to become a large buyer of green hydrogen to drive down costs. And of course, Minister Jay Shankar, was a wonderful host and helped us arrange the entire visit. Ultimately, this all culminated with Secretary Kerry meeting with Prime Minister Modi. And the meeting went well when about an hour after the meeting, the Prime Minister tweeted that given the two nations' shared desire to combat climate change and our complementary strengths, the US and India can creatively collaborate on a 2030 agenda for clean and green technologies in the service of the planet. I mean, that about sums up the week, right? It was a fascinating week of meetings with key officials. We then had a whole day of wonderful meetings with civil society and the private sector. We had a great meeting with the Women in Energy group, the South Asian Women in Energy group that Vaishali Sinha chairs. We had a great business roundtable. Sumant was there. And we had a series of other great meetings. So we came out, Secretary Kerry is super energized, and we're looking forward to having Prime Minister Modi at the summit on Thursday and to hearing his major announcements. So I'm happy to take questions and to the rest of the program. Thanks again, Amar. This is a terrific event.
Thank you, Varun. Fascinating description of your trip. And we have someone else to talk to you about this, not me. I'm going to bring up Sumant Sinha, who's in the audience, who was your old boss. And he and you can talk for a few minutes about the potential collaboration between the two countries. Who better to do that than someone who runs a company and someone who's also on our side kind of advocating for climate action. So Sumant, how are you?
Yeah, hi. Good evening, Amar. Great to be here. Varun, always a pleasure to listen to you and to talk to you, of course.
So good to see you, Sumant, and thanks for taking this time. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, looking forward as well.
So I'd love to kick off. One of the questions that Secretary Kerry asked you when you met him in India, which I thought would be useful for the folks we have here, is I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it would take to overcome some of the regulatory obstacles in the way of India's 450 gigawatt target. If those were met, what useful things the US could do to mobilize investment. You had shared some thoughts on how the US could partner with India, and I think those are fascinating, and Secretary Kerry really took those to heart.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Varun. Your questions always are difficult and insightful at the same time. But look, that I think is the heart of the matter, which is how will the Indian government make policy from here on to achieve the fairly ambitious targets that it has set out. We all know that ultimately, the power sector in India is a concurrent subject. So what that means essentially under the Constitution of India is that a lot of it sits with the state governments of India. And so therefore the state governments of India actually need to fundamentally also have the same vision about climate change issues and moving to clean energy and so on. And that's not always the case. They don't have the same kind of shared vision that the center has. And one of the things that, of course, we discussed when Secretary Kerry and you were here, Varun, and thanks, of course, for leading that trip and making it so efficient and effective for I'm sure Secretary Kerry, who got a really good insight into what is happening in India, is the fact that we need to get more subnational, participation. We need to get more states in the US, perhaps engage with more states in India, and make it a much more direct dialogue. And we also need to essentially ensure that we privatize the distribution utility sector in India, because that ultimately is a big unreformed part of the overall power value chain. That if that doesn't improve, then we're not really going to see the kind of pickup in clean energy and efficiency in the power sector as a whole that we require. And as you know, today almost 25% of the power that we generate in India is wasted or not paid for because the distribution utilities are not able to charge for it, or they don't charge for it because of political issues. So unless those kinds of very fundamental issues are resolved, I fear that that is always going to hobble the power sector substantially. And so that's one big area that we need to resolve. The second basic thing is that we need to put together this whole framework of how we're going to get from here and 90 gigawatts of renewable energy to 450 gigawatts in the next 10 years and beyond. What are the strategies around storage? What are the strategies around wind versus solar? Or how are we going to do green hydrogen in the future? All of those things require a 10 to 15-year roadmap. And I think the government has to do some thinking in that regard. And that's really where I think cooperation and help from people like you will really be very useful for the Indian government as well, because the kind of insights that you guys can bring to bear from the kind of resources that you have in the US to help the Indian government in charting this path, I think can actually be very, very useful.
One of the things I wanted to say on that point, and thank you, Sumant. We of course will take this back, and the Secretary listens very keenly to your advice. One of the things I wanted to cite here was the U.S. State Department, which is where I now sit, has a great program on this 450 gigawatt target. We've used our national laboratories, like Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and we've done some modeling that shows that 450 gigawatts, surprisingly, is the least cost option for India. One might think that it would actually cost a lot of money to shut down some of the coal fleet and to transition to renewables. It turns out to be the least cost option, even when you take into account the cost of balancing storage and transmission. One of the other things that I thought was very interesting coming out of the sessions was the economic opportunity, particularly when it came to Indian manufacturing. Now, there are certainly areas where the US and India could collaborate in spurring FDI, for example, into India. But then there's this interesting set of questions around, well, if India starts to support domestic manufacturing and initially the costs are more expensive, does that come into conflict with its 450 gigawatt deployment drive, which currently is driven on the back largely of imported solar equipment? In wind, of course, there's a lot of domestic production. I'm curious how you think about someone squaring that circle. Is there a tension, or is it just kind of a temporary tension until India's manufacturing costs come down?
Well, first let me say that India has to definitely set up a manufacturing sector in renewables, because we cannot forever keep importing solar modules from China, because we'll be replacing in that case one kind of energy dependence which we have on the Middle East and other oil exporting countries for oil, to China for solar panels. And I think having dependence on China for anything at this point in time, given all the geostrategic issues, is not the smartest thing in the world. So I think from that political standpoint, it is very important for us as a country to really, in some ways, move towards becoming Atmanirbhar, which is really what the Prime Minister has been talking about, and become self-reliant. Now, the question is a very appropriate one that you've posed, which is, if that results in higher costs of solar energy, then does that not feed into everything else? And that's absolutely correct. But I think this is really where the value of solar prices having come down to this extent really comes in handy. Today, solar power in India is 60%, 65% cheaper than coal-based power. And so even if you have domestically manufactured modules, and they are to some extent more expensive than Chinese modules in the beginning especially, it'll still be 50% cheaper than coal-based power. And so there's such a lot of buffer now in terms of where the costs of solar have come down, that even if you add in a few extra costs of domestic modules and so on, I think that cost can very easily be absorbed. What can also, by the way, be absorbed is the cost of intermittency management, which is through storage and so on, which also, therefore, if you put solar and storage together, including with imported, with the domestic modules, that whole cost will be a lot cheaper than imported, than coal-based power. So I think it's still very useful. But Varun, let me ask you a question as well. You've now been at it for the last almost let's say, is 70, 80 days in the Biden administration. How has the experience been so far? And of all the things, of all the great things that you've done in your short but very sort of brilliant career, where would you sort of rate this at this point in time? And what is the kind of sense that you have about being able to make an impact?
Loaded question. And look, Sumant, I will always say my time at Renew Power will rank first. But in the last 100 days, the thing that I think I'm most excited about is seeing all of the threads come together in this summit. On Thursday and Friday, especially on Friday afternoon, we're going to release this fact sheet, and it is just ballooning with the number of accomplishments that the Biden administration has achieved already. There's a section on innovation. It's at 8 a.m. on Friday Eastern time. I hope everybody tunes in, where I've been helping to pull together the session on innovation. It's going to be a fascinating session, and we have some very exciting announcements to make. So I'm really excited that the first 100 days of a new presidential administration, particularly one where we have not divided government but unified government with Congress, is a fascinating time. It's a time of no sleep. And add that to the jet lag. It's been a little rough, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's exhilarating, and I was just glad I got to see you, Sumant, to see so many of our friends in India, and to get to talk to you for a little while. Hope you can all tune in for the President's Summit on Climate. I promise it'll be a great show.
Great. Thank you, Varun and Sumant, for all the work you guys do to bring India and US together. And once more, just Sumant, I thank you for the book. It's a great read. I just read it over the weekend before our event, and I'd encourage everybody to get a copy of the book. And thank you so much to both of you for being here.